Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. It's a real honour to be speaking at this lecture, particularly to be commemorating someone so evidently inspiring. I imagine many of you know, but I didn't and had to look it up, that Professor Colonel Draper was one of the first people, one of the first Allied officers to get to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp at the end of World War II. And he spoke later in his life very compellingly about the profound impact that had on him, that experience had on him. And then, of course, as has been said, he was on the prosecuting team at the Nuremberg trials. And so obviously a man deeply touched by some of the things that then led to the human rights treaties, some of which I'm going to touch on this evening, but not just from the perspective of being a great legal mind, but also one evidently just of a humanitarian. And I think as we approach Armistice Day and commemorate the First World War, it feels like it's a very fitting time to be speaking in the memory of someone like that and to be thinking about humanitarian law and the principles of humanity that underpin it. It was not much before that time, just 5 years before the Second World War, and at a time when Britain was still very much in the grips of the Great Depression, that Liberty was founded. And for those who don't know, Liberty is the UK's oldest human rights organisation. And it was founded in quite a specific moment of the history of these islands. Namely, there were hunger marches going on at that time, and there were people up and down the country who were starving, didn't have the money to feed their families. But when they sought to walk from the north of England all the way down to London to present a petition to Parliament asking for food, they were met pretty much at every turn with brutal policing tactics. And it was witnessing that brutality, witnessing this very callous response to a pretty fundamental human right, the right to food, that meant that a group of people got together one evening in St Martin's in the Fields, not very far from here, and formed what was then called the National Council for Civil Liberties and then later became called Liberty. And among their number were some great writers and some great activists, people like Vera Brittain and Clement Attlee and H.G. Wells and E.M. Forster. And I think H.G. Wells in particular is a great inspiration, another person perhaps, and of Professor Draper's generation to be thinking of at times like these, because H.G. Wells wrote in 1940 a book called The Rights of Man. And that book is widely credited as having formed the basis of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and then, of course, our Human Rights Act. He was very close friends with the Roosevelts, and they themselves wrote a lot about the impact that H.G. Wells had on them. Anyway, this group of people got together in St Martin's in the Field and formed this organisation and then wrote to the Manchester Guardian to announce that the NCCL had been born. And they said that the reason that it had been set up was because of the increasing tendency towards the general and alarming encroachment on the liberty of the citizen. And in the name of that liberty, liberty with a small l, and then of course later liberty with a capital L, they wanted to maintain vigilant observation of the proceedings over the coming days. And when the marches took place over those coming days, the marchers flew banners with the words inscribed, "With your help, we march on." And that story, that founding story about liberty, is really what we still do today. We maintain vigilant observation, and with our help, we hope that people march on. And for almost a century now, Liberty has been holding the powerful to account and standing up for people unswayed by profit or political agenda or popular opinion. And if you were to come to Liberty's offices, and you'd be very welcome to come and pay us a visit, in addition to an extraordinary amount of cake, much of it is vegan, you will find a surprisingly small but exceptionally dedicated group of ordinary people who are working day in, day out to challenge intolerance, injustice, and abuses of power wherever they rear their ugly head. And of course, it's not just the 30 people in that building. It is every one of our 11,000 members. It is every one of our 32,000 supporters. And it's every one of you. It's everyone who is united in what I think is the most simple and profound of beliefs, that everyone in this country is entitled to be treated fairly and with dignity and respect. We think really that our work, and I think people have said this forever, but in 2017 and 18 months ago when I joined Liberty, there have been many times when we have sat back and thought that really our work is needed now as much as it has ever been. I think it's pretty trite, but perhaps important to say that we live in extraordinary times, that politics, it seems, is putting pollsters out of business, and we are careening from one surprise outcome to another. And that starts with the EU referendum, and then the arrival of a new Prime Minister, the inauguration of Donald Trump, the announcement of a snap election, a minority government, a deal with the DUP, and to this day, every day, it feels like our news feeds are crowded with the rise and fall of big personalities and big ideas. Just in the last week, it seems that patriarchy is wobbling on its pedestal, that cabinet members are falling from grace, and money is moving further offshore than I think probably any of us in this room ever realised was possible. And the news moves so fast that I suspect that the momentous moments that we are living through will take up more pages in the history books than the minutes we've ever actually spent thinking about them. When you think just in the last year, we've had all those things that I've mentioned, but we've also had Grenfell Tower, we've had the rise in hate crime, we've had movements like Black Lives Matter. At times, I think, political rhetoric has plumbed new depths in the last 18 months. It has often stoked fear and division. It has felt as though security has been trumping liberty, that stability trumps dissent, and that political whim trumps democratic debate. I think that this feels like the year that we tore up the rule book. And true story, my life motto has always been, there's no fun without rules, which made me a really tragic teenager, but a really good lawyer. And I think it's very easy to feel that as the rules get broken by the very people who are meant to uphold them, we are all at sea. It's very hard to see how you can speak truth to power when you can't even be heard above the din of fake news. It's very hard to see how you can champion protest when dissent is seen as disloyal. And it's very hard to see how you can give voice to marginalised people when populism rules supreme. So I think there is no doubt that these are hard times. They're hard times for those of us who believe that our private lives should not be an open book to spies, or that the accident of nationality shouldn't expose you to dangerous discrimination, or that mistakes should be learned from rather than covered up, or that politics without compassion can be a very cruel game indeed. It can feel as though some of the things that we thought were settled, battles decisively won and consigned to the wrong side of history, can come back round. And I think for me in the last year, the most striking example of that was when Theresa May went to visit Donald Trump. And you may remember that around that time, people started talking about torture. And Donald Trump repeatedly was refusing to condemn torture techniques, and Theresa May wasn't being very swift to condemn his failure to condemn them. And I woke up one morning, as I'm sure many of you do, to the dulcet tones of the Today programme, where no doubt in the admirable pursuit of neutrality, the BBC had someone on the programme who was very against torture, and then they had someone on the programme who was kind of quite for torture. And it was extraordinary because just like that, you're sitting there with your cup of tea, listening to the most genteel radio station in the world, and torture is being put on the table like there are pros and like there are cons. A bit like if slavery was being discussed and one person was saying, well, it's terrible, and another person was saying, yes, but it does save us money. And it felt in that moment, anecdotal as it is, it felt like we'd lost something really important and something that perhaps we hadn't even realised that we stood to lose. I think in moments like that, for me anyway, it can feel as though the roof is falling in. And in those moments, and because of my love of rules, I find myself reaching for the architecture. And so I reach for the things that we have in place, that our forefathers and foremothers put in place for us, things like the Convention, things like the European Convention, Article 3 of which, of course, outlaws torture. I reach for the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act and the Modern Slavery Act, this architecture of a movement of civil liberties that Liberty and so many others have helped to build. But this year, I have really realised that we have to fight to keep it standing, that we have to fight hard just to hold the line. So we have to fight to keep the Human Rights Act, we have to fight to stay part of the European Convention, and we have to fight to make sure that in this great constitutional shake-up that is Brexit, we keep hold of the rights and freedoms that we got from the European Union. Having said all that, and though it might be surprising to hear it, I do stand here today feeling pretty optimistic. And that, in part, is probably because you really couldn't do my job unless you felt very optimistic about most things. But one source of my optimism is that in the last year, I have seen moments of activism going mainstream in a way that has been really, really inspiring. And I think it's been a year where so many people who wouldn't necessarily have called themselves rebels or revolutionaries or mutineers or rule breakers have suddenly sat up and listened and felt a little bit more engaged and a little bit more empowered and ready to speak out and stand up for the things that they believe in. And so I go forward with my work at Liberty feeling like there is a huge groundswell of support for the values that we defend day in, day out. And feeling like at times like this, times of great change, there are very good reasons for looking to human rights as the thing that can provide a guiding light. And it's sort of, again, it's trite to say that human rights can provide a framework for us. And people like H.G. Wells or Professor Colonel Draper or other veterans of war, I'm sure, understood it very well, and so much that they probably didn't even need to think of ways to articulate it very often. But sometimes I think it does just bear remembering why these fundamental things are worth signing up to and defending. Of course, human rights are all about protecting the citizen from the overweening state. They uphold the rule of law, they uphold democratic values. They were written down over the years by some of the greatest legal and political minds that we have ever known. They've been scrutinised and finessed by judges over generations and endorsed by every civilised nation in the world. They're political, of course, but not party political. They are not beholden to any religion, but they're not so secular that they can't uphold faith and religious belief. They are there to put values in places where values might otherwise be lost, so they can work with the operational demands of policing or military combat. And they evolve with changing attitudes, operating what I find to be a complex and dynamic and quite extraordinary balance between individual freedom and collective interest. And all of those reasons are more than persuasive enough, I think, academically, rationally, to persuade even the staunchest skeptic that human rights provide us a value system upon which we can build something very strong and very powerful. But actually, for me, the most potent and profound reason for signing up to this whole concept of human rights is or has become a much more instinctive one. One which shows that thinkers and lawyers and campaigners and politicians and academics are absolutely right about why human rights are so good in theory, but that people who don't necessarily have law degrees or offices in Westminster or letters after their name, people who don't need to have experienced tyranny or genocide, really understand it too. And I came to that understanding through my work as a legal aid lawyer at Doughty Street, where I learnt that I could walk into any room and meet any client, and that we would have that understanding in common. Early on in my career at the bar, I had one of very many formative moments when I represented a family whose teenage daughter had taken her own life in psychiatric care. And I was representing the family in the inquest into her death, to find out what had happened and what had gone wrong. And like so many of these cases, there was a whole litany of really tragic failings. Medication had been missed, checks hadn't been undertaken, things which you would hope that hospitals now would have learnt to do, things that put vulnerable people at risk. There were two features of that case that got to me on a pretty cellular level, and I think got to the jury who were sitting on it. And it spoke to me so much of this instinctive meaning of human rights. So the first thing was that we had CCTV of Gemma. Gemma was the name of the girl. And she came into this hospital. Psychiatric wards are not necessarily very welcoming places, but she'd been in and out of psychiatric care her whole life, but she'd never been to this hospital before, never been to this ward. And she turned up, and she was small and frail and very obviously deeply distressed and frightened. And she was 19. And she showed up at this ward, and she sat on a chair in a corridor, and the CCTV runs and runs and runs for 3 hours, and she sits completely still with her head down, and patients and staff walk past her, and not a single person in that 3 hours stopped to say hello to her or ask her name or see if she was all right. And the second thing that really hit me, and I think hit everyone in that courtroom, was that when Gemma eventually was taken to her room, she was left alone for a short period of time, and she managed to tie a ligature around her neck using a pair of tights. And when the staff found Gemma, they called 999. The paramedics arrived, the paramedics rushed into the room, and there were 4 members of psychiatric staff in the room, and the paramedics turned to them and said, "What is this young woman's name?" And none of them knew. And I remember thinking, as I was cross-examining people and sorting out evidence and bundles and the things that you do when you're a lawyer, but I remember thinking, this is the meaning of dignity. This is the meaning of dignity denied and rights deprived. And when you're doing these cases, and it's an extraordinary privilege as a lawyer because you spend weeks with these families who have to just let you in on what is an incredibly private and personal and difficult time. And you sit with them day in, day out, with them as you cross-examine doctors that were caring for their children, or police officers that were restraining their brothers and sisters, or prison officers that didn't hear the cries for help of their parents. So it's humbling at the best of times, but this conversation was extraordinary because it was the first time that I realised that you didn't need any of the legal stuff to understand human rights. Because we were sitting in the canteen having a cup of tea, and Gemma's mum said to me, "I just don't understand, because I thought Gemma, as a vulnerable young woman who everyone knew had mental health issues, I thought she had a right to be protected." And I said, yeah, she did. She does. Article 2 gives her the right to be protected. That's what Article 2 is. To me, it's black and white law written in a statute, but to you, you just know that because you're a mother and a human being. And then her dad said, when Gemma first died, the hospital contacted us and they said, "Don't worry, we're going to do an investigation into what happened." And we said, "Thanks very much," we put down the phone. And then at dinner that day, we were sitting around as a family and we just thought, it doesn't feel right that the hospital should be doing this investigation. It feels like someone else should come in just to check that nothing went wrong, not because we're conspiracy theorists, but just to check. And we thought that maybe we had a right to an independent investigation. And again, I said, yeah, you do. Article 2 gives you that right. Article 2 gives you a right as a family member to have a full and fearless inquiry when your loved one dies in state custody or care. And as I say, it was the first of many moments, and I could talk all night about the conversations I had with my clients. But It was the first of many moments when I realised that my pretty academic, pretty privileged, pretty legalistic understanding of why human rights were important was something that went very, very much deeper for ordinary people whenever they had the misfortune, and it is a misfortune if you find yourself needing to use your human rights, but when they had that misfortune, they got it instinctively on a cellular and emotional level. And that, of course, applies to all of the people who have to use them, whether it's the Hillsborough families, whether it's young recruits who died in the deep cut barracks in the 1990s, any family who has lost someone in immigration detention, in psychiatric care, in prisons, or in police custody. And I challenge anyone to talk to one of those families and not to come away with the very strong feeling that human rights are there to protect people and that we diminish them at our peril. So what I hope in this time of great change is that we can have a proper conversation about rights and freedoms, an open and lively one, because that's only what's appropriate in a democratic society, but one that is not starved and impoverished by hyperbole and political intrigue and playing politics with something that is so much more important than what happens in Westminster. I think we all have an obligation to demand that kind of conversation. I think we have an obligation as citizens to take seriously the business of lawmaking. I think we have an obligation to dedicate genuine discipline and energy and awareness and effort to try and bring about positive change. I don't think it's easy, and I don't think it happens overnight. At Liberty, that's something that we try to do every day, but obviously it's hard and it requires rigour and it requires energy. One of the things that we're working very hard on at the moment is in relation to Brexit. Now, Liberty was neutral on the outcome of the referendum. We take no position on whether the UK should be inside or outside of the European Union, but feel very passionately that the vote was not about human rights and that people who voted to leave did not vote to leave their rights and freedoms at the door. So we are leading big, broad coalitions, and in this day and age they have to be big and they have to be broad, to show that workers' rights, victims' rights, citizenship rights must be protected, and that taking back control means democratic scrutiny wherever that happens, whether it's in Brussels or whether it's in Westminster. But of course, although Brexit looms very large in the limelight at the moment, I think it would be wrong for any of us, and I say that perhaps most pointedly at our politicians, to forget that there are a lot of other pressing issues that need attention, that didn't just go away when we decided to leave the European Union. And many of those issues are issues that have a huge impact on the lives of people in this country. It's not very far from Liberty's office, it's not very far from this building, that the remains of Grenfell Tower stand. And the shell of that building is a dark icon of the injustices and the inequalities that still run very deep indeed in this country. It is a tragic reminder that even the most basic rights still have to be fought for. And it is a monument to what happens when human rights are disregarded and when human life is treated cheaply and wasted. I think that when you see those pictures, you would do well to remember that we are no different from those people. It's very easy to think about human rights as being about other people, their human rights. You might have a different life to me. You might hold a different passport or pray to a different god or live in a different postcode. But like everyone who lives in a tower block, you want to sleep safely in your beds. Like everyone on that hunger march in 1934, you want to be able to put food on the table. We all want to be able to protect our loved ones. We all want to be able to be free to refuse and resist and dissent. Those are all of our rights, and they are vital to all of us. And of course, each age comes with its own innovation. It comes with its own set of challenges, although you can draw golden threads of principle through all of it, of course. our age is no different. And like so many things, H.G. Wells predicted that there would come a time when we would carry around in our pockets devices that would allow us to be known very intimately indeed by the state and by the people who have a monopoly of force and control. I mean, he predicted it. He predicted everything. He predicted the atom bomb. I mean, the man was incredible. But he did predict the smartphone. And he knew about mass surveillance, of course, living in the 1930s and 40s. How could you not? But he also predicted that new capabilities would change the face of mass surveillance altogether. And I think that technology for us now, in this generation, in 2017, technology is a new frontier where old principles still apply, but where possibly the relationship between citizen and state is changing in quite a tectonic way. It's civil liberties at its most pure, I think, and I think we would do very well to remember that it's the civil liberties of all of us and not just of people who might be whistleblowers or protesters. You can glimpse, we talk about technology, it's such a big topic, but you can glimpse the significance of these kinds of developments, I think, by testing them against a kind of classic civil liberties model. And the classic one for me is always the police. The police are the quintessential manifestation of state and citizen, the quintessential manifestation of one body that can use force lawfully, and then one group who can't and may have force used against them. I'm not saying anything bad about the police, that's just the facts. What's fascinating then is to look at how new innovations in any different era are developed and implemented by the police, and what that then says for how we navigate issues of civil liberties. And technology is no exception. In Durham, today, now, the police are using an algorithm to decide who should get bail. In Kent, now, the police are using an algorithm to decide where they should be putting their resources to police antisocial behaviour. And in the West Midlands, they are about to roll out a huge piece of predictive policing technology which will determine their resourcing and determine who they should be stopping and searching. Now, just pausing for a minute, I didn't know much about algorithms until a few years ago, and I came to it very much from a human rights perspective, not a technologist perspective. But for those that don't know, an algorithm is a type of machine learning, and all that means is that you can, by using an algorithm, create a machine that can learn by example. That's kind of all you need to know. As everyone knows, unfortunately, humanity, me included, sometimes sets bad examples. And those examples are very often ones that you maybe would not want a machine to learn and to replicate on a vast scale. So, for example, it's well known that many policing practices are racist. They have a racial bias. Stop and search is the most obvious example of that. It's well written about, and many successive governments have tried to reform it to make sure that because you are a young black man walking the streets of a city, you are not more likely to be stopped and searched. But the fact is that you still are. So in Bournemouth, for example, young black men 12 times more likely to be stopped and searched than young white men. That's the data set about stop and search. Now, leaving aside the problems with stop and search, that's what the raw data is, because that's the practice as it is now. If you feed that raw data to an algorithm, the algorithm can only learn from the examples that you are setting it. And so what the algorithm will do is it will replicate a system that is riven with racial bias, and it will not be able to learn and interrogate and correct itself. Algorithms in America are stopping people getting jobs. So again, and it's an example of how very often these technological developments impact the most disadvantaged, many of the big companies, the big corporations in the States, people like Walmart, have now outsourced their recruitment for the lowest paid jobs to algorithmic decision making. What that means is that they are training the algorithms what a good candidate looks like. That includes having keywords which might indicate that someone has a mental health problem, or has anxiety, or has a very long commute, or has caring responsibilities. Tailoring the questions so that the answers that you give, multiple choice answers that require you to pick certain words, will give a better profile of whether you're going to be a good worker. Of course, if you found out that a human being was doing that, if you found out that a human being hadn't given you a job because they suspected that you might have a mental health problem or that you might have caring responsibilities, you'd have a cast iron discrimination claim. But what do you do when the algorithm can't give you reasons and when the data that it's based on looks, to the untrained eye, like objective population data? How do you use systems of transparency and accountability that were never designed for the digital age? So go back to the police officer example, go to Durham. You get arrested and you get denied bail. In the old days, in what now feels like a kind of almost Luddite way of making sure things are fair, what you would do is, if you thought that it was unfair that you'd been denied bail, you as an ordinary citizen could say to that police officer, give me the reasons, give me the written reasons for why you've deprived me of my liberty. And they would have to do it. If in those written reasons you found something that was prejudiced or irrational or unfair or unlawful, you could take those written reasons before a judge, an independent judge, and that judge could demand that you are released. What do you do when it's the algorithm that doesn't release you? How do you get reasons? How do you go before a judge? How do you uncover prejudice or irrationality or unlawfulness? These new technologies are going to demand that we rethink our entire systems of law. And the only way that we will be able to navigate our way through a devilishly complex task and keep pace with the technological developments and keep pace with government is if we start with the framework of principle that human rights already gives us, the framework that gives you liberty, that gives you proportionate and legitimate decision making, and that gives you non-discrimination. Of course, surveillance, as I say, has been part of this picture for hundreds of years. The capabilities now look very different, and so now you can have mass state surveillance in ways that were unheard of 50 and 100 years ago. As you may know, Liberty has always done and will continue to do a great deal of work on mass surveillance. We're currently bringing a legal challenge, a real tanks on the lawn judicial review of the Investigatory Powers Act, which is an act that passed into law last year. And that act allows the communications data, and what that means is that's messages and your address books and your browsing histories and your emails and your terms that you plug into search engines, all to be scooped up by the state, to be searched and filtered and stored in case of some suspicion of serious crime. We have been led to believe very often that this is all about counter-terror, and of course that's part of it. Although whistleblowers from spy agencies around the world have pointed out that if you just swamp people with data, it doesn't make it any easier to find the needle, it just makes the haystack bigger. But also something to be really acutely aware of is that the people who also have these powers and who are using them are people like HMRC and the Gambling Commission and the Food Standards Authority. People who aren't engaged in the business of serious crime or counter-terror, but who might want to be able to understand and profile human behaviour a little bit more closely and make assumptions about how you might behave and what the state thinks about that. Some of the latest powers to intrusively surveil people were contained in a bill called the Digital Economy Bill in a section about troubled families. So this is not extremism, this is not violence, this is trying to profile families who may require state intervention. And there have already been examples of big data being used, for example, when people have smart fridges and when sell-by dates talk to the smart fridge and the data from the smart fridge is available to the state and the state is watching a family because they think they might be neglectful and they see that their food is going off time and again, is that evidence for intervening in that family's life? So what we want at Liberty, and you will read extraordinary understandable but extraordinary PR about terrorist sympathies that we and every other human rights organisation has. None of that's true. All that we want is a world where surveillance has to be suspicion-led, where unless you're suspected of a serious crime, your data is your data, so that if you have searched for a Samaritan's hotline, or the address of an abortion clinic, or an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or if you gamble online or watch porn, all of these things being entirely lawful activities, the state does not have a right to know about it. I don't have any truck with those tired old truisms, like if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I don't think it's okay anymore in 2017 for the government basically just to say, trust us. And I don't think that it's right that liberty and security are a dichotomy that have to be traded. So what we have to do is protect things that have always been sanctified. Things like lawyer-client privilege. Things like making sure that a journalist does not have to reveal her source, or that an MP does not have to reveal the contents of her conversations with her constituents. Just as a police officer would require a warrant to search your house, all we are asking for is that they are also required to have a warrant to search your phone. Now, I don't know about you, but I swear that if I was faced with that choice, if I was asked what was more invasive, someone rummaging through my underwear drawer or rummaging through my smartphone, I can absolutely tell you every time I would let them into my house and I would not let them onto my device. Because on my device is my whole life and my whole identity. The other critical thing that I think is at work at the moment, and these are the two touch points I wanted to talk about this evening, and we'll have time for questions afterwards. I think technology is one, the other I think is immigration. The two often are, of course, very much connected, because where you have technological capabilities that can be used to carry out immigration control, you can bet that they will be used. You can also bet that a lot of people won't really care. So, for example, at the moment, there is a piece of legislation going through Parliament which allows data protection rules, all data protection rules, and these aren't new, these have been around since the 1960s, to be lifted if the data is sought in the name of immigration control. That's not just people who are suspected of being migrants. That could be your data if you're suspected of renting a house to a migrant, or a doctor treating a migrant and not sharing that information, or a police officer dealing with a victim of crime who is a migrant, or a bank clerk opening a bank account for a migrant. Your data could be mined just to help with an investigation that purports to be about immigration control. That's buried in a schedule in a bill that's being debated in the House of Lords this week. I think one of the things that we will look back on this generation and think about is how we've treated our immigrants. It's a really old saying that you can judge a society by the way that it treats its prisoners. But I think we have to update that now. I'm not saying we treat our prisoners very well. We could do a whole other lecture on the state of the prisons in this country. But I think right now, we would do better off if we were judged by how we treat our prisoners than if we were judged by how we treat our migrants. As you may know, since 2012, there has been a policy, a government policy, called the hostile environment. Their name for it, not mine, even though it sounds like a campaign name. And the purpose of that policy is to isolate and demonise undocumented migrants. Of course, it has the effect of doing that very same thing to anyone who doesn't look British or sound British or purport to hold British values, whatever they are, never defined. No one has ever been able to come up with a definition. And what I think is happening is that the effect of these hostile environment policies are sowing real suspicion, real division in our communities. We are seeing children being kept back from school because their immigrant parents are afraid they are going to end up on a list. We are seeing people not seeking vital healthcare because they are afraid that the doctors will shop them to the border guards. And at the heart of all of this is what I think is the greatest stain on this country's human rights record, and correspondingly the thing that we just don't talk about enough, although if you've ever heard me say anything before, you'll have heard this because I always talk about it, and that's immigration detention. And every year in this country, we detain 30,000 immigrants. 30,000 is a third of our prison population. These are people that have done nothing wrong. They are not serving a criminal sentence of imprisonment. Their deprivation of liberty is not authorised by any judge. It's the only setting in the entire system where you can be put in a prison on the say-so of a politician. In recent years, the lid has been lifted by brave investigative journalists and whistleblowers and lawyers and campaigners and detainees themselves, demonstrating the filthy and overcrowded conditions, the levels of physical and sexual abuse, and the terrible degradation of people's mental health in these detention centres. One inspection report uncovered someone who had been in detention, who had lost all mental faculty for 9 years. 9 years is longer than most people serve for a sentence for murder. Never seen the inside of a courtroom, never had their detention authorised by a judge. On 6 occasions in as many years, the High Court, just there, wherever it is, found breaches of Article 3 of the European Convention, the right not to be tortured arising out of immigration detention. Those are the cases that just get to court. I saw tens of those cases cross my desk. They, of course, settle for tens of thousands of pounds, and the settlements come with confidentiality agreements, and you are never in a position to say to your very often broken client, do you know what you should do? You should do the brave thing and blow the whistle and not take the money. You would just never do that as a lawyer. So this story is one where if it was happening in our police cells or our prisons or our hospitals or anywhere, I think there would be almost a revolution on the streets of this pretty conservative country, because we wouldn't tolerate repeated breaches of Article 3 unless they were being done to a class of people who we found it very easy to ignore and forget about. And so what I urge of you this evening is to just pause and remember that 30,000 people, innocent people, are locked up on these shores, part of a policy designed to make life intolerable for migrants here. And to think, as we embark on this great change in our nationhood, as we have an opportunity to create a new foundation myth, is that what we want to be a part of? Is there an opportunity, as things crumble, as things seem to break left, right and centre and things feel so uncertain, is there an opportunity to stand up for some of the values that we would like this nation to be known for? Could we put an end to some of those injustices that are being done in our name? Next year, there may be some opportunity to make some headway with this issue. There will be an immigration bill in Parliament because of Brexit, and we hope that we may be able to get an amendment putting a time limit on immigration detention. We are still the only country in Europe that has no time limit. So watch this space for a big public campaign led by Liberty and many, many other organisations to try and put an end to this horrendous situation. But as I say, and I end on this, I do, in spite of all the bleak things that I've talked about, I do feel optimistic, because I do feel that times of change are times of opportunity. And I think that we can create a much more inclusive, much more compassionate, much more positive political culture if that's what we demand of the people that we vote for. Tens of thousands of people in the last year have marched or signed petitions or formed coalitions or joined local campaign groups or made their voices heard in whatever way that activism means something to them. And I think we see that when we are united, trite to say, we are more powerful than ever. So join something. Join Liberty, join Amnesty, join whatever organisation that speaks to your values and lets you be held accountable to your ideals. Do something that means you are bigger than just your one voice or just the voice of your family or of your neighbourhood. And if you need a reason to do it, and I think for me, sometimes on the days when I let the pessimism creep in, I do need a reason to do it, then think about future generations. Think about the country that you would want your children and your grandchildren to inherit. Think about the people that you would want to come to this country and feel welcome. So I just want to finish with the theme of the lecture, which really has been H.G. Wells, if I'm honest, and give you a quote that I think is incredibly optimistic and infectious and inspiring, and one that I think we would do well to remember when we try to make the world a better place. So in 1901, he said, "All this world is heavy with the promise of greater things, and a day will come, one day in the unending succession of days, when beings who are now latent in our thoughts and hidden in our loins, shall stand upon this earth as one stands upon a footstool, and shall laugh and reach out their hands amid the stars." And I think that every one of us has an obligation to make that a possibility for everyone in this country and for everyone who is to come. Thank you.